All right, good afternoon. I guess it is afternoon, everyone. Before we get into the program, we're just going to give a land acknowledgement here before our presentation. In the spirit of healing and education, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribes with historic ties to the state of Colorado. These tribes are our partners in which we consult, especially in regards to archaeological work. We recognize these indigenous peoples, especially the Ute, Pueblo, and Dene, as the original inhabitants of the lands being discussed today. Despite the formation of the state of Colorado displacing these peoples, ties continue economically, physically, and culturally through ranching, hunting, and traditional practices in and surrounding Lone Mesa State Park. The Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation is committed to acknowledging this in all aspects of Colorado's history. So again, welcome everyone. As Erica said, my name is Rebecca Simon, or better known as Becca Simon. I am the Assistant State Archaeologist and State Park Coordinator. I also previously worked at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, as well as multiple cultural resource management firms. So I have a lot of different aspects of my job that relate to being involved with Lone Mesa State Park and kind of an interesting history in terms of leaving the Southwest to take on this position and then come back to end up doing fieldwork in the Southwest. So I'm very happy to be with all of you. I'm going to hand it over here to Holly to give a little intro about herself and her connection to the project, and then we'll get into some archaeology.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Thumbs up, Becca? Okay. My name is Holly McKee-Huth, and I work for the Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. Like Becca and Erica mentioned, I wear a number of different hats. One of my main jobs is to help maintain and manage the statewide cultural resource database for the state of Colorado. As of late, I've been doing a lot more compliance work. Archaeologists all over the state have been very busy with projects and sending that data into us for review. I've worked here for about a little over 3 years now. Prior to that, I did actually work in the Resource Stewardship Office of Colorado Parks and Wildlife. There I did some of the same jobs, but I also worked hard with the other members of the resource stewardship staff in aiding parks in managing and preserving their resources. And in my case in particular, it was cultural resources. One of the ways that we did that was that we would develop what we called resource stewardship plans. And what they did was we would compile a bunch of information, natural and cultural resource information, and provide them to the park managers to help them manage the resources that they had in their specific parks. A component of these management plans was to identify what were termed sensitivity zones. And these zones were leveled at high, moderate, or low probability in running into cultural resources in the course of development, and then providing suggestions on how to manage those resource areas to avoid impact to potentially significant sites. So with that, historically, like I said, park analysis for these sensitivity zones, you utilized a form of predictive modeling based on previously surveyed areas, site location, site density, and the eligibility of previously recorded sites. And when I talk about eligibility, I'm talking about their eligibility to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In my time at CPW, we tried to improve upon these models. Not only did I want to create a model that helped with land management, but I also wanted to create one that helped land managers understand and tell the story of the landscape. It was fortunate for me that during my time at CPW, I was also working on my master's. So I utilized the work that I was doing to improve upon these sensitivity models in my master's research, which focused primarily on prehistoric high elevation land use patterns, and in particular during the Archaic period. It was my goal to conduct a pilot study, so to speak, to not only look at the validity of current models for land management purposes, but to improve on those models while at the same time continuing to contribute to theoretical frameworks and practices in archaeology. And then I was taken to Lone Mesa. And prior to us making this trip there, I did a lot of research on the park and its cultural resources and decided that it would be a perfect place to test this model. So while I'll get into more of why Lone Mesa kind of fits nicely into this research, I'll give you a quick context of Lone Mesa. So Lone Mesa State Park is located on the easternmost portion of the Colorado Plateau, in the area that's locally referred to as the Dolores Plateau. It's about 23 miles north of the town of Dolores. The park encompasses a little over 11,700 acres and has about a 1,500-foot elevation difference from the lowest and highest points, ranging from about 7,600 feet at the lower Plateau Creek to around 9,000 feet on Lone Mesa itself. Besides Lone Mesa, the park also encompasses, again, the headwaters of Plateau Creek, which runs through the center of the park in a north-south direction, and it has a number of small creeks and tributaries that help distribute a number of different very special habitats within the park. I'm gonna now kind of turn it over to Becca so she can kind of give you a background of the cultural history of the Southwest where Lone Mesa is located, and then we'll get into some of the model stuff.
Okay. Well, as Holly mentioned, so I'm going to probably give the quickest cultural history of the Southwest that I've ever given in order to get a little bit more information about the models. But feel free in the chat to start throwing, or I guess typing, when you hear the words Southwest archaeology, what do you think of? Go. Let's see, can I see the chat at all? Maybe with the sharing of the screen, I can't, but that's okay. So keep it coming, throw it in there, and you know, just keep in mind that when we're talking about the Southwest, we're talking about a lot of different areas. Here we go. Oops. So we got some national parks. Mesa Verde, Chimney Rock, exactly, okay. Oh, whoops, let me go back a little bit here. So Mesa Verde is about 45, 50 miles away from Lone Mesa State Park. And both of this region is often called the Mesa Verde region. We also, in some references, when we talk about this area, we talk about the Northern San Juan. It really depends on how you're trying to contextualize the region and the different resources and the types of cultures that you're connecting to. As you know, that the peoples who have, indigenous peoples who have lived through this area now encompass predominantly the Ute, the Pueblo, as well as the Navajo or Dene, but none of them are living directly in this particular location. And I'll show you how that kind of got to be here in a second. So even though this is obviously not in Colorado, this is a classic picture of what people think of, generally speaking, when it comes to Southwest archaeology. You have your big blocks, your adobe, your wonderful alcoves, lots of permanent structures here on the landscape. But in terms of understanding the archaeology that we are talking about here with Lone Mesa, you have to remember that this is a very, very small sliver of the big story here in the Southwest. Human activity has occurred throughout the Southwest for at least 11,000 years by people that we deem the Paleo Indians, and they are probably, we have evidence of people living as nomadic, big game, huge megafauna hunters. We're talking the bison, the mammoths, mastodons in this region from about 11,000 BC to about 7,000 BC, give or take. And we don't have a ton of actual physical remains of these people. They were moved a lot. They lived in a lot of temporary locations. And when you're talking about 11,000 years, that stuff just doesn't preserve. Now, we do have, from big, large archaeological surveys, individual points and different things like that, that show that people were in this area hunting and living Paleo-Indian lives, but we don't have a ton beyond of evidence beyond a couple of isolated finds here and there. That being said, Dr. Jesse Toon down at Fort Lewis College is actively working on filling in our data sets in terms of information about the Paleo-Indian period in the Southwest. The period of time that and cultural and life ways that we're most interested in with the Lone Mesa project is what called the Archaic. And we're talking about 7,000 BC to about 5,000 BC. And while these people living in the Southwest typically are still pretty mobile, not as mobile as in the Paleo-Indian period, we're now seeing more what's called generalized hunting and gathering. So not focusing as much on certain types of resources, but definitely using the landscape as it provides. The cultures and peoples that connect the Southwest Colorado to other archaic peoples are likely the those from the far, far Southwest down in southern Arizona. Just like we see in the Paleo-Indian times, the stone tools are probably the most important archaeological data in the sense that it preserves and provides us time markers to understand periods, as well as different groups of people on the landscape and throughout time, looking at these cultures. Their life, their architecture was a combination of pit houses, brush structures, things called wickiups, which are holes either leaned up against another tree or against each other. And we have lots of evidence of additional types of practices and not just hunting and gathering. You know, we have rock art, symbolic activities, little twig figurines that are classic to the Archaic period. So if you were going to find an archaic site, this is actually a little bit north of Dolores up in Mesa County, but it's still part of the Colorado Plateau, but a little shelter, just like this. You might have a hearth, you might have a lithic scatter, you might have little pieces of stone tools there, but in terms of big expansive sites, most likely they're not really in your face. You're not going to get big blocks. Now, that being said, we do have evidence of people building villages at a small scale compared to other periods of time. But here in the Colorado Plateau with our lots of canyons and lots of sandstone, this is the type of place that you will most likely find a archaic site. I just want to reiterate the concept of this general farmer or general hunter and gatherer. So in those locations when we find hearths and do different things like that, we identify plants and other types of materials that are used by archaic peoples. Goosefoot is one of them. And we see that this is really important in following their life and how their mobility works, in the sense that we're looking at different types of resources on the landscape. If you are picking plants, you gotta figure out a way to process them. So in addition to hearths, we also actually find manos and metates, grinding stones, and they are common with U-square that really is indicative of processing nuts and other types of hardy plants that you would be gathering in the woods. Some of the most frustrating moments on survey is to find a mono and no metate. But when you're talking about archaic sites, sometimes the metates are actually within the bedrock, especially if you're overlooking a canyon or something like that. And sometimes those monos can be sort of the first Swiss Army knives, in the sense that they come with not only grinding surfaces, but pecking and hammering surfaces as well. So our diagnostic markers in a lot of ways, so the things that give us a specific time and specific groups of people on the landscape, are the stone tools. So here's a couple of examples of archaic points that were found in a site at Jefferson County. But we see these similar types of points throughout Colorado and into the Southwest. As compared to the Paleo-Indian period, where you have these long lancelet, very thin, very elaborate types of projectile points, here in the Archaic period, they are still dart points and being used for large animals like elk, but they are usually fairly thick, pretty utilitarianly made. That's a made-up word, but thick, regular, and processed en masse. They're using them a lot. Here's some examples of these kind of fishtail type bases that are classic in the Archaic period. This is from the Yarmany site up in Eagle County, which has a similar type of environment in terms of being mountainous as to Lone Mesa. And here's some other archaic points that you might find down in the Southwest. We have, in the Southwest, you have the Cochise tradition, the Elko series, and as well as a number of others that make the Archaic period marked on the landscape. We also have the Oshera tradition, but that sort of overlaps the Paleo-Indian and Archaic period quite a bit. And thank you to the American Southwest Virtual Museum for these really awesome photos of projectile points. So coming around about 500 BC, while people are settling down individually and in the communities throughout the Southwest, movement doesn't stop at a cultural and larger scale. We see movement of these people going throughout time, but just instead of it being individuals following resources, it's entire communities. By 500 BC, we start the Pecos system. So we start talking about basket makers. So basket maker 2, basket maker 3. And this is where we start having agricultural, sedentary lifestyles being the norm. We have, coming into the Southwest, we have what are considered kind of our Western basket maker and Eastern basket maker with ties to those earlier archaic peoples from the South. Around 580, we have people coming from not only the East and West, but also from the North and South, creating these larger basket maker communities in what is now the Mesa Verde region along the Colorado Plateau. For more information about how that's happening, please stay tuned for the Basket Maker Communities Project final report coming out of Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, because they just wrapped up analyses and production of all that information. But really, in a nutshell, we see that people are coming from different portions of the community and settling and really creating large communities of basket maker folks and agricultural folks here in the Southwest Colorado. So through the basket maker period into what we call Pueblo I, so now we're talking about 700 AD to about 900 AD, people are located in this sort of same area. but obviously their lifestyles will change, and I'll show you some pictures of that here in a second. But by about end of the 900s into about early 1000s, we see large people coming out of Colorado Southwest into other portions of northern New Mexico, and establishing the infamous Chaco Canyon. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Chaco Canyon, it's a large village site with lots of buildings and massive amounts of artifacts that have come out over the years. Lots of archaeological work has happened, and it was really quite a phenomenon, considering the landscape and the amount of people that it supported. The Chaco Canyon had its pretty big heyday about 1050, and then we see people leaving this region and ending up back into the Mesa Verde region. So then you start seeing those large pueblos like Sand Canyon, Yellow Jacket, and the like, as well as in the last kind of portion of this formative ancestral Puebloan timeline that we have for the Southwest, we start seeing places like Cliff Palace and Longhouse over in Mesa Verde. So you might be asking, well, how do you know if these people are not just walking around and it's the same people, or how do you know that people are just having more babies in these areas and instead of just moving around? It's a lot of statistics, and projects like the Village Ecodynamics project, as well as other large big data set researchers are looking at the prevalence of different patterns of different types of archaeological material and seeing where they show up across the landscape. And they figured that birth rates and death rates cannot create the numbers of archaeological sites in these regions, and you can follow that through the landscape. By 1300, we have peoples leaving Southwest Colorado, leaving the Mesa Verde region and establishing the communities that we see amongst the Hopi, the Zuni, and the other Pueblo communities along the Rio Grande down by Santa Fe and the like. And that's where we will see peoples today. So by and large, you'll see how these people are committed to being farmers and they are agriculturalists. But I don't want people to forget, they were also hunting. They were doing some deer, they were also hunting some rabbits. And so we do have material culture that we can compare and use in the Lone Mesa project, talking about hunting for Pueblo people as well as archaic and other historic groups throughout. Some other material culture that you would find during this formative era or this ancestral Puebloan tradition, pottery is huge. And so we have a timeline of pottery connected to those different periods that I really quickly went through. And you have black on white pottery, you have grayware potteries, and they are used for a combination of different types of ceremonial, but also very practical in life ways. We see other types of tools in addition to pieces of pottery, you know, mauls and axes and different things like that, digging sticks, and depending on whether or not we're talking about an alcove site or versus an open air site, the preservation of these materials differ from site to site, but we have been able to compile for many, many years lots of information about that these people were true farmers. Who knew that corrugated pots could be so dramatic, right? So this is a cooking pot and they're huge. It's a big vega, and during the Pueblo III period, so that kind of 1100 to 1300 period, we see that people are storing a lot of food, water for their communities and really embracing these sedentary lifestyles. Remember those manos and metates that I talked about in the archaic period? We'll talk about manos and metates on hyperdrive when we're talking about living in one place and processing your agricultural goods, as well as whatever you're gathering along in the landscape. Because remember, there's still hunting and gathering. Here's a look at some of the architecture. Now we see that in the archaic period that by and large, it's more temporary, but places like Yarmany House up by Eagle shows that we do have some sort of dug-in features. But here in the Southwest, typically dug-in architecture is really a classic with these agriculturalists, starting with the basket maker 2, but all the way, but really solidly by basket maker 3. Something that is really important with the agricultural and ancestral Pueblo lifestyle is order and organization. So by Pueblo 1, we have this organization from like north to south of room blocks, kiva, and other materials, whether it be midden and the like. Here's a really nice example from the Ute Mountain Tribal Park of how your above ground rooms as well as your underground rooms and then everything else with the site. We see this tradition start in other and be representative in other portions of ancestral Puebloan life, but it really does continue throughout time. The actual construction of these different materials do change. Sometimes the kivas are smaller or sometimes they're deeper when you have less wood to create different types of roofs and things like that. But we do stay consistent patterning connecting these people. Here's just an example of what it is to make an underground room. This has been connected to a lot of the different sites throughout the through the Southwest. So this is what we think of. We're going to expect to see a big old kiva dug in the ground and the like. Well, in Little Mesa, we're not going to have that. I really just showed this because this is one of my favorite examples of human activity and adjusting for the situation that I've seen amongst ancestral Puebloan and formative era archaeology and architecture. This balcony house kiva, if you can see over here, they started to dig a hearth over here, and it would have been in the very strict north-south alignment that I was talking about is kind of indicative of this period. But it's in an alcove that faces to the east, and so the airflow spruced that all up, and so they had to do literally a hard pivot, put the hearth in, and then adjust for the natural environment. So even though there are these strict patterns and things that we see throughout time, people are humans and they adjust and adapt. So by 1300, we see people, the Puebloan people, the formative agriculturists sort of leave this region. Now, after 1300, we are seeing archaeologically people that are traditionally considered the ancestral Utes and ancestral Navajo coming into this region. Now, I must reiterate that according to oral tradition and native tradition, these people have always been here. When I say that they're coming into the region, these dates and this timeline is referring strictly to the archaeological record, not necessarily how oral traditions and cultural practices play out. So what do the historic Utes and historic Navajo people look like, or the remains of their sites look like? You know, we are back to wiki-ups and structures and temporary locations. They have a focus on nomadic lifeways and are hunting and gathering very similarly to what we've seen in the archaic period. My good friend down at Crow Canyon, who, as a member of the Ute Mountain tribe, Becca Hammond, always likes to remind me that if it wasn't for being made to be on a reservation and start farming, Ute people's archaic lives could very well likely have been the same as 7,000 years ago. They were creating pottery, and we find that all along the Colorado Plateau, called Ute Mount Uncompahgre brownware. It's very coarse and very different than what you would see even from a kind of unburned, unfinished Pueblo pot. Navajo peoples are traditionally in mud and slightly dug into the ground hold-ons, but also created different types of pottery to store their goods. Now, by we consider the historic period for the Southwest as really starting in 1881, because the U.S. government forcibly removed all the last of the Ute peoples into the 3 reservations that we have today. Now, European Americans showed up in the landscape starting back in the 16 and 1700s with the Spanish. Don Rivera was one of the first documented to be in the region. But here in the Mesa Verde region, there was a lot of focus on ranching, logging, and more, and those types of industries after the 1890s and into the early 20th century. So what archaeology has been done inside Lone Mesa State Park in relationship to the rest of the archaeology that we have a ton of information about? Well, in 2010, Woods Canyon conducted a archaeological survey as a result of some developments and questions that the state park had for what they can do and what was going on in the park. And they surveyed 2,575 acres, and they identified 48 cultural sites and 84 isolated finds. They broke down into into 34% of those unknown prehistoric. So little pieces of stone, flakes along the landscape, but not being able to identify into whether it's Pueblo or Ute or historic or formative or archaic or what the like, because it's just materials. The next would be about 32% was the historic component, so those logging and ranching sites that they identified throughout the park. And then they also identified ancestral sites at about 6%, as well as some historic Ute sites at 2%. Archaic sites made up about 26% of the sites that they identified. And here's an example, some of the projectile points that they identified in that work. So something to keep in mind that this survey was really quite comprehensive and gave a lot of insight. 6% in the heart of the Southwest is connected to ancestral Puebloan lifestyles, so understanding that agricultural information, you're not going to get that here in Lone Mesa State Park. Now, hunting and archaic and other lifestyles looks like something we definitely can look into. Another thing that we wanted to consider with this project is the fact that we have 48 sites and 84 isolated finds. And when you are recording, that totally makes sense, walking around, looking at the parameters, oh, you're 50 yards away or 50 meters away, creating those circles. But then when you look at them as a big data set and as and the totality of the landscape, we start to think, well, are these really broken down? So you start getting the splitters and the lumpers, right? And trying to understand the both the impacts of this data, both as a management side, as well as understanding the life ways of these people is a big part of why Holly has the models that she did. Okay, so I'm gonna stop talking about bigger ideas, a bigger region, and hand it over to Holly.
Thanks, Becca. So as Becca mentioned, there was a long cultural history that we're seeing in the archaeological record at Lone Mesa. But again, of interest to me was the archaic period. And we did find a good amount of sites dating to the archaic period. The reason why this period is so important, you know, Becca mentioned a lot of this, but we have changes in diet. It's more diverse. We see increased processing activities. With that, and as a product of that, we see changes in tools. Again, we also see longer stays. We're not getting rid of our seasonal rounds. But like Becca said, it's a larger communities and we're moving around and staying in one spot a little bit longer. And then we start seeing the intensive use of mountainous environments as well. Over the centuries, it was thought that the archaic era people accumulated a tremendous knowledge of wild plants in varied environments. Things like trees, shrubs, grasses, and herbs were used for every conceivable purpose, including house construction, clothing, medicine, food, tool manufacturing, you name it. And it's argued that their understanding of these varied environments and wild plants helped them to transition into a more permanent settlement lifestyle where they could cultivate their own plants. Historically, scholars believe that mountain zones such as those found in the Colorado Rockies were inhospitable and absolute barriers that restricted human movement through prehistory and and permanent stays. However, more recent studies within just, I don't know, the last 2 or 3 decades, we've been seeing that the Rocky Mountains were continuously used from the Paleo-Indians era through the post-Archaic eras, but prehistoric advancements in technology and land use made settlement in these areas and in these zones not only possible but probable. So it was also thought that residential or more permanent camps, as it were, would come in the form of structure and large camps. Becca mentioned this as well, but in the Archaic, we don't really see that. That doesn't mean people weren't staying in areas long periods of time. It's just they weren't building those permanent structures. So some models, specifically a theoretical model called the broad spectrum model, suggests that the mountain regions could have been a part of a seasonally based residential mobility pattern, with base camps located in temperate mountain valleys, and people would then conduct foraging activities radiating out from those areas, from their camps. This is thought to account for large camps and special use sites in these areas during the same time period, where many of which were previously thought to be tethered to lowland occupations. The assumption behind this model is that people, regardless of whether or not they're practicing a logistical, so where their main residence is down in the lowlands and they're just going up for short periods of time to the mountains, or their mobility pattern, or they're practicing a residential one where they're moving their whole camp up to the mountain, people will evaluate their environments and place themselves in areas with high resource potential and diversity. So hunter-gatherers would schedule seasonal occupations in highland environments, such as the mountains, because of the wide variety of resources they were able to procure there. So, which brings me to one of the other reasons Lone Mesa is so important in understanding prehistoric land use patterns. At Lone Mesa, elevation, geology, terrain has allowed for this mosaic of vegetation and wildlife habitat in a relatively small geographic area. You have a mosaic of different vegetative communities. So on top of the mesas, you can have oak and aspen. On the hillsides, you can have conifer, riparian forests, and then wet meadows. Then below the mesas, ponderosa pine woodlands, sagebrush shrublands, upper montane grasslands. And then within these different communities, you also have a subset of vegetation common to these different communities. And then as a result, you also have a variety of wildlife that is common to these different communities. So on top of all this diverse landscape of potential vegetation and wildlife resources, you also have Plateau Creek, which is and its different tributaries. The water's resources in this park help to distribute the obviously important mosaic vegetation and wildlife habitat throughout this area. So with that said, it's pretty obvious to see that Lone Mesa fits nicely into that model that requires high resource potential and diversity for people to occupy a space for prolonged periods of time when practicing what we call a residential mobility pattern. Lastly, the park has not been developed and therefore open to the public. And as a result, the diversity of habitat, environment, and the archaeological record is relatively well preserved, which allows for scientists to come in and collect a significant amount of important data. And it's not just archaeologists, but it's natural resource specialists as well, who can get in there and collect data that will contribute to our understanding as well of the archaeological record within this area. So as Becca mentioned, a good amount of the park has been surveyed. It's about 22%. But it was restricted, as most CRM work is, to areas of potential development. We'll get into what that means for different sensitivity models and issues that it could cause. But we'll go ahead and move on from there. So now that we know what makes La Mesa special and important in understanding and reconstructing land use patterns, I'll get into the initial development of the model and how we're actively trying to improve on it. The goal of predictive modeling in archaeology is to model past human behavior by means of spatial analysis, and to use those models to determine the probability of undiscovered sites in a given area. In the last few decades, this approach has become increasingly popular in the discipline due to the use of geographic information science and systems. Cultural resource management work, or CRM work, has been a major proponent of this type of work as well, particularly in regards to helping manage cultural resources in areas that have not been surveyed but may be slated for modern development. Although there are many different methods to do this type of work, the end goal is to provide landowners with management recommendations for current and future protection of archaeological resources. Most models use existing spatiocultural data relative to different environmental variables that may have influenced the placement of sites. And when I say spatiocultural, it's the location of known sites. So we have a UTM or other sort of coordinates for that site. That being said, there are some innate problems with predictive models. First of all, we're trying to predict human behavior, which will never be an easy task. Second, they are highly variable in their results. Some use existing cultural data to predict where other sites might be located. But when there are biases in the way that that cultural data is collected, there will obviously influence the outcome of that model. CPW uses the term sensitivity zones. And in my time there, I kind of grew accustomed to this term, and I felt that it was a better representation of the output that these models produce. While some seek to predict where sites may be located, with the model that I'm trying to create, I'm looking for a way to predict the way that the land was used prehistorically, and identifying sites will just add to the robustness of that data set and help me create and test these models. So we talked about hunter-gatherer mobility patterns. What's important to keep in mind with hunter-gatherer mobility models is that they're based on the assumption of efficiency. So again, people will place themselves in diverse environments that they won't have to travel far within to exploit necessary resources. It's hunter-gatherer and logistical and residential mobility strategies are a result of decision making in a subsistence economy. Sorry, that's a tongue twister. You're going to place yourself basically in an area where you can get more bang for your buck. So it's thought that these strategies, organization, and mobility patterns are adaptations to these varying environments. So understanding different environmental variables that may influence the patterns observed in the archaeological record. With that, it may be possible to identify, but also predict different settlement subsistence strategies. So, the idea behind this initial pilot study was to identify the foraging radius potential within Low Mesa, and then try to translate that information into sensitivity zones for park management. In order to develop a foraging radii, it was important to try to understand and identify where people chose to place their camps based on the ability to maximize foraging returns relative to transport costs. So terrain in this model plays a major role in transport costs and the size of the foraging radii. In higher elevations, it's assumed that the foraging radii will be reduced because of the cost of transport. Additionally, in these environments, residential mobility will be low in lower areas. So this type of model has been used in past studies to identify 3 high elevation site types. So base camps, so it's a group occupation for an extended period of time. Special use sites, so these are task specific sites. These are your resource procurement sites. So lithic scatters, different things like that. And then secondary camps. These are camps that while you have a residence, you're going to be traveling further away from your residence, potentially for high value resources. And because of the time it takes to get there and then do your procurement and then come back, you would likely have to do a longer stay. So more temporary camps is what those would be. So the first step in developing this model is to try to identify what I call optimal zones. I have a long list of different environmental variables that I want to use and incorporate into the model, but I thought it was important to test kind of the very basic variables that are commonly used in these types of predictive models. So instead of arbitrarily assigning different values to different environmental variables within this model, I created these optimal zones based on statistical analysis on areas that meet several different requirements based on data extracted from sites in similar environments and elevations. So the big ones were distance to water. Slope is used in these models a lot, and we'll get into slope because it's an important one, but there are some problems with it. And then aspects, so the direction that these sites are sitting on a slope. So then I took the mean of these variables, popped them into the initial part of this model, and basically told the GIS to show me the areas that meet the criteria within this a given geographic area. And in this case, it was Lone Mesa. So these up here are the means that were being used to develop these optimal zones. So then you have the results. And I'm gonna pop this open so I can zoom in. So all of these areas in black are what are identified as the optimal zones based on that certain criteria. And I tested it in Lone Mesa against existing cultural data that was collected by Woods Canyon. So these pink and blue dots, or teal if you want, are the sites and data collected by Woods Canyon. The pink dots are camps, and the other like turquoise dots are or sites are what we would call task-specific sites, so lithic scatters and different things like that. So as you can see, the majority of the recorded sites that are identified as camps are located within this optimal zone, but not all of them. So that tells us there's something going on in the model. And I don't know how to get back to the presentation. There we go. Okay. So from that, the next step was to create the foraging radii and develop the sensitivity of the model. I utilized the location of the known camps to develop this model. I used cost distance analysis. There's also something called Euclidean distance analysis. The difference is Euclidean is a straight line distance between 2 points. So any given area, it tells you where you are from a source point, which has its utility, but in this case, I was looking for how long it would take to travel to a certain area. Cost distance analyses takes into consideration different variables that would make distance greater or potentially smaller relative to the time it would take to get to the certain area. So for this study, I used time it would take to traverse the terrain to get to a given area based on how long it would take to traverse, and slope was the main, what we call a friction layer. So it takes you longer to get up certain slopes than others. So the assumption is that a certain degree of slope, it would be too difficult to traverse, and therefore the probability of someone doing so would be less likely. And then the distance for these catchments, so to speak, were capped at 10 kilometers because it could go on and on and on. And the time was capped at 8 hours. So again, I'm working under the assumption that people are placing themselves and their base camps in this diverse environment where economically they will get more bang for their buck. When I'm talking about cost, I'm speaking of energy output to procure resources relative to the return you get from those particular resources. Basically, is it worth traveling 4 hours for a resource if you're only catching rabbits? Is a very basic example of that. So it's an economic cost. So the results of the foraging radii and cost distance analyses. So it was broken into 4 different zones or catchments, or however you would like to term that, but I call it zones to initially make it easier to read and identify patterns. So I'm going to click on this so you can see it a little bit better. So the red outline there, sorry, that's a bit blurry. The red outline there is the state park. Then we have our 2-hour catchment or zones. So that's in purple. And then we have 4-hour, which is in green, 6-hour, which is in yellow, and 8-hour, which is in red. Anything that doesn't fall into those zones, the model said these are your absolute barrier. Based on your absolute barriers, people aren't going there. Again, there are some problems with that. Let me see if I can click on this one and if it's any better. Oh, it's a little better. So the first thing that we see with this model is that we don't have a continuous landscape. So again, these areas where there's nothing going on, or the model saying there's nothing going on. The second that we see is that even though it's not continuous, there's a significant overlap in the landscape in these areas, meaning the foraging radii is overlapping here. So these are good zones for foraging. It not only shows a connectedness with the foraging radii, but potentially with the camps, because remember, we're running this model off of all known base or camps within Lone Mesa. There were some unexpected results as well. I'll come back to that one. Some unexpected results that I found interesting. One is that the model has potential to show movement into the area. So I should have just kept that open. If we look at this, oops, that was the wrong one. I apologize. If we look at this one, it's saying there's nothing up here. This doesn't fall well into the catchments and different things like that. It might be safe to assume that people are entering from the south there. But again, that's a big assumption, so we just need to be able to collect more data. A second unexpected result was the contribution of isolated finds in understanding and reconstructing a cultural landscape. So as Becca had mentioned, the isolated finds kind of go all over the place, but they fall within these catchments or these zones. And I think it would be safe to say that it helps validate the intensive use of that immediate area. We can't just disregard isolated finds as we sometimes do. So how is this useful for land managers? Well, currently it's not very useful, but as it could be. As it stands, we might say that optimal zones and 2-hour catchments could be considered high sensitivity in a cultural landscape. However, that would mean the majority of the park would be designated high sensitivity, and that's just no good for park managers. So if we use the model as is, we would bring in already surveyed areas and designate those areas that previously didn't find sites on, and maybe designate those as moderate sensitivity. And I say moderate because although nothing was recorded during survey, there is a strong probability in this area that subsurface deposits could occur. So for this image, this yellow here is all that previous survey, and everything outside of there wasn't surveyed. So what I'm saying is optimal zones and already surveyed areas, you know, we might change the sensitivity on that. But I think it's going to take some time with the land managers as well to understand their land management needs and potential development needs. So, so that all that tells us there's some tweaking that needs to happen with the weighted variables in the model. For example, is it appropriate to make any slope in this type of environment an absolute barrier based on the results and where we're seeing some of the task-specific sites located? I would probably say it's not. This in turn would give us a more continuous landscape view of these zones. I also think that time catchments need to be shortened. So these 2 hour, 4 hour, 6 hours, maybe shortening them to 1 hour, 2 hour, might show us some different patterns that we aren't seeing with these larger zones. So testing the model, the model needs further testing. Specifically, low sensitivity zones need to be tested. It's always important with predictive models to test those other sensitivity zones. Areas that are slated for development, I think it's safe to assume that where we're wanting to develop and occupy is likely similar areas to those that people in the past wanted to occupy. And so it's kind of like, of course, it's a high sensitivity area near water. So it's also important to test these kind of models that are designed for highland and high elevation land use patterns in lowland areas as well, to see if they are really environmentally specific or if they work out in lowland environments too. I think a lot of cases in the CRM work, we tend to translate them to both, and that might not be appropriate. It's also important to note that this model thus far suggests that these variables are not enough to predict potential sites, yeah, maybe optimal zones, but to give us a better understanding of how land was utilized. To do that, we need to keep collecting data, environmental and cultural. You know, we can't separate people from their environments, and we need to keep testing on larger data sets. One of the things with testing is, what if you don't have existing data? Well, will these models work? I would argue that they should, because you're not always going to have existing data. If you can identify these optimal zones, those zones should then be the first up for survey. If you can't or don't want to do that, you can still run these cost distance models off of those optimal zones and get similar results, but you're always it's never gonna replace boots on the ground. And that's an important thing to remember when we're talking about these predictive models. So these images here are of, so you have the survey in yellow, and then you have these different blocks here, these different survey blocks here. And what these are areas that PAC had gone out and surveyed a portion of. And so they went out and surveyed a good amount of area. Here's a close-up of some of these areas. And with these, I'll show you. You can see that the camps are falling within these optimal zones and this 2 hours foraging radii zone. But then we have this lithic scatter here that's sitting on top of an area that the model is saying nobody should be going up there. So that's a problem. So living in, so there's a lot of assumptions and biases and problems with these types of models. I think one of the bigger ones with this model is vegetation. So the current model assumes vegetation didn't play a significant role in movement throughout the area, but we know that vegetation would have not only restricted areas that people could move through, but there is potentially more value in different vegetative communities and the distance people would go to procure those resources. And so we need to consider that too. Like I said at the beginning, I worked on just a few of the basic variables that turn up in all of these models to test the validity of those. Those still need tweaked, but now it's time to start adding some of these other variables as well. Including slope would be another big one that I still need to do some tweaking on. One of the other problems that we just face in archaeology in general is the visibility of hunter-gatherers in the archaeological record. Like Becca had mentioned, they're not as visible as, say, you know, their lowland counterparts that have more permanent settlements. But that's also why it's fun to try to find a way to enhance their visibility in the archaeological record, and potentially doing that through different models like these. So there's obviously a lot more work to do to help develop this model, but one of the biggest steps is testing the current variables through survey. Last year, CPW and our PAC program partnered in such a survey. And with that data that they collected, I will be able to continue to build up this model. I unfortunately was not able to go out with them because I was fortunately welcoming my beautiful baby girl. But Becca will tell you a little bit more about the PAC program and what they did in Lone Mesa.
As Holly mentioned, the program for avocational archaeological certification, which is through the Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, there you go, went and did a survey of portions of Lone Mesa State Park, and it was threefold in the sense that it was getting this data to help further this research, as well as assisting CPW, the Colorado Parks and Wildlife, to help with their management programs in the future, as well as to create educational opportunities for members of the public in terms of archaeological practices and archaeological understandings. Here you see the second half of our crew at the end of the program. We've surveyed over a number of locations in the about approximately 30 years of the program's existence. A little bit has been done over here in the Southwest, but it was very exciting to bring PAC back to the Southwest through the Lone Mesa State Project. As I mentioned, we did a lot of educational work. Here, this photo shows not only what we were doing out there on the site, teaching individuals how to do survey and what it was like to conduct archaeological survey, but also collaborating with our resource stewardship team at CPW, with Caitlin over here, and then Kimball Banks over here as a member of our OHP survey crew. Here's a little video of what it looks like walking through Long Mesa State Park. So here we have a couple of our volunteers, Nancy and Don, and they were actually really helpful in helping identify some of our historic resources, as Don was a former Forest Service individual who helped understand like the differences between historic logging versus current logging. And you'll notice that in the landscape, we have the difference of the lowlands versus the vegetated areas with the pinyon juniper forests, and the diversity of the resources that we'll be identifying there. So what did we find? Well, over a course of 10 days with 16 volunteers who were there for various amounts of time, we surveyed about 600 acres across those 5 blocks that Holly showed in her maps. We had 10 staff members from both CPW and History Colorado come out at different times, including staff that weren't part of the archaeology team. We were really fortunate to have folks from different parts of History Colorado come and help out. Through this project, we've identified 11 new sites, most of which were prehistoric, but some had historic components. I put an asterisk there because this is in connection with these modeling patterns, really making sure that we are looking at the landscape and deeming different sites appropriate to how we're distinguishing these sites, as opposed to just, on the ground, 50 meters apart type conversations. We've expanded 2 of the sites that Woods Canyon identified in their survey. And again, we have a large number of isolated finds. Now, that may be just because there's isolated finds along the landscape, but we want to take a closer look through Holly's model to see if those isolated finds have a larger role to play in understanding how this landscape is being used, in addition to helping further our model. The types of resources that we found were temporary camps, as well as historic sites related to the logging in the area. There was one little small logging operation that occurred for a couple of years in the northeast portion of the site. We actually didn't find a ton of what we would hook, line, and sinker identify as archaic. We actually found a couple more late prehistoric projectile points than we expected, but we'll take a look at what does that mean in terms of the overall data sets from both the Woods and the PAC surveys to come. So what do we got to do to wrap this all up, Holly?
I didn't unmute myself, I'm sorry. Well, we got a lot still to do. So, again, we need to do additional analyses. There still needs to be some tweaking of our understanding of the variables that are already been used. We want to just keep collecting additional data. CPW is a really good data source with what they collect as far as natural resources, and they will be they will play an important role in kind of helping us find the appropriate ways to reconstruct past environments, which will really be an important aspect of this. Vegetation and ecology of dominant species, how that changes the landscape, fire and how that changes the landscape, climate. We need to look at other databases, again, to kind of help build up the robustness of ours and this model. And then one of the big parts of this project that I want to bring in is we really can't talk about land use patterns, sensitivity, and resource management without including a Native voice. One of my future goals to this work is to work with our Native American indigenous population partners to not only help me better understand the use of these areas like these from their perspective, but utilize their knowledge to help me develop this model. While environmental models may tell us a lot, and I say we can't separate people from their environment, there's another aspect to that. You know, these models may tell us that the mesa tops were use on the mesa tops were unlikely, but we know that there are different uses and spiritual uses of prominent points on the landscape, and that has to be considered in some sort of sensitivity model, particularly in resource management and park management. As the model is currently being designed with prehistoric land use in mind, it's also important that we don't forget other parts of the archaeological record. So, you know, protohistoric, historic use. Like I said, Lone Mesa is this really great place that had a long, was used throughout history and prehistory. And we need to consider all of those in the development of these types of models as well, and how well they fit into it.
Okay.
On to you, Becca.
Yeah, no, and so in order to accomplish getting that data, the plan is to get back out to Lone Mesa State Park come 2021 because of dealing with current situations. We did not have the survey conducted here this year, but in the spirit of trying to create these data sets and create these relationships, we'll continue to work with all of our partners, CPW, the various tribes and connections, as well as identifying additional partners in terms of bringing people into the conversation about what this area entails. We'll be cleaning up our current data and making sure that they both make sense in terms of recordation of the region, but as well as seeing if it helps us understand these models in any new light. And then we'll also be looking at trying to create more collaborative processes in following the leads of large projects in the Southwest, like the Village Ecodynamics Project and the like. While this is very small potatoes compared to some of the data sets that they pulled together, we hope to kind of use their inspirations to continue this work. All right, so lots and lots of people to thank for this project. Mostly you all for spending extra time with us, because as we've significantly ran over, but I really appreciate everyone being here. I want to acknowledge all the different people who worked on the field work for the PAC program, including the volunteers, as the CPW and the OHP staff. Want to point out Crow Canyon's references, as I used to work with them, so I use them a lot in this presentation, as well as other resources. Esri is a great product for the creation of these models and these products and these maps, and Holly has become an expert in all of that. I also just want to give a very special thank you to my co-presenter, Holly, as she has allowed me to be a part of this brainchild of hers, and couldn't be more honored. Anything you'd like to say, Holly?
Well, I would like to ditto that and say, you know, Becca and I had talked about this in the coming weeks, that it's, you know, Southwest archaeology, it's hard to get into, and having an expert here to kind of piggyback on some of the work that I'm doing and inform me and educate me on a lot of this stuff has been super cool, and she will continue to be a valuable resource for me in continuing to develop these models, and it's been really cool working with you on this. So, and I just wanted to do a shout out to CPW as well. While I was getting my master's, they were all about letting me do this work and use their models and sensitivity models to continue my research and to as a benefit to them, but also myself. So again, this has been a few years in the making. I was off for haven't touched this for a little bit, having a new baby on board, but it's been great getting back to it, and I am looking forward to continuing to work with everyone on this. So.
All right, well, I'm happy to sit on, but I imagine most people have either stepped away or have other things that they need to do. I'm going to put my email here in the chat for if you have any additional questions after you sign off here. But I can stay for a couple of minutes to if there's any pressing questions, for sure. One that was listed in the box was, did archaic peoples ever develop writing? And the only quote unquote writing that we would have would be the rock art that we see, not writing in the way that we have like publications today. All right. Well, thank you all again. Oh, and Holly put her email in the chat as well, so feel free to send us questions and interest in any of this work that we're doing.
Thank you all very much.